This is All of It. I'm Allison Stewart. Thank you for spending part of your day with us, whether you're listening on the radio, live streaming, or on demand. I am grateful that you're here. In honor of the country's 250th anniversary, we're devoting Fridays to history. Today, you'll hear part of my full bio conversation with historian David Waldstreicher. He's the author of The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley, a poet's journey through American slavery and independence. Poet Phillis Wheatley was the first African American, the first enslaved person, and the third colonial-era woman to publish a book of poetry. Wheatley was born in Africa, and at just 7 or 8 years old, was sold to a Boston family around 1761. Susanna Wheatley was looking for a companion and ultimately a servant. Phyllis's intellect was immediately apparent. Soon she began to read and write and write and write. She published her first work at 13 years old. She would go on to become a literary phenomenon. Waldstreicher describes his book as a joint exercise in history and literary criticism, and he uses Wheatley's own poems, as well as the backdrop of the looming American Revolution, to tell her story. David, how did you go about researching Phillis Wheatley's story? Where did you start?
It's very easy to start because there's not very much in terms of the usual biographical material. There are the poems, and there are a dozen and a half letters, and there's one scholarly biography by Vince Coretta, and there's some other evidence, things people said about her. The book really took shape as a narrative when I started to read the Boston newspapers. I laid my eyes on every page from 1761 when she gets there to the end of her life. So that's 23 years. And as I went along, I started to notice a lot of instances where there was just more context that could be brought to bear on what she was thinking and doing and who she was doing it with.
David, you spend some time using history to provide us context clues as to how Phillis Wheatley's existence, what it would have been like for her to move through the world in Boston and even in London at this time. But specifically, what's important to understand about Boston during the time that Phillis Wheatley lived there?
One thing is that there are more Africans there than we usually think when we think about the North or we think about Boston in this period. And there's evidence, especially from the numbers of fatalities, which are listed. This many white people died this month, this many black people. It's pretty clear that it's more than 10% black in Boston at this time. There aren't really good demographic numbers, so it's always been estimated, and sometimes more based on censuses that are like really statewide rather than specific and that aren't necessarily key to that decade that's most important to her development. So not only are there a lot of black people, but there are a lot of young black people and who assimilate surprisingly quickly and are spoken about in the evidence we have in newspapers for their sale or recapture if they run away as quite skilled. So we've talked about Phillis Wheatley as this kind of hothouse flower who gets an unusual education, but really she's assimilating, making herself useful, and trying to get something closer to freedom in the process, like a lot of her peers. And that becomes increasingly obvious during the imperial controversy when the presence of Africans and their children in crowds as a potential fifth column, people who might become useful to the occupying British soldiers and authorities. By the time we get to the Boston Massacre, there's a series of incidents when Bostonians and New Englanders talk about people like Phillis Wheatley as people who might make a difference in the imperial controversy. And that helps open up the possibility that these political controversies might have implications for slavery because it starts to be thrown in their faces. And Wheatley is there during all of this. So it's not just that the ideology of the American Revolution tended toward liberty, tended toward anti-slavery. It's that actually the presence of these people pushing made it an issue, made people make the connections and say that you're going to talk about your liberty, you're going to talk about freedom, and you're a bunch of slaveholders. It was being thrown in the faces of the Bostonians. Wheatley is seeing that. She's reading these newspapers, and then she starts riffing on these things, and then that makes all the difference in terms of what's possible.
David, born around 1753-ish, by 1761 or thereabouts, a 7 or 8-year-old girl was kidnapped on this boat, likely the Phillis. And you describe that boat as being owned by a, quote, experienced slave trader. Given his trade routes, what can we deduce about Phillis Wheatley's origin?
It's very difficult to say with certainty what her origins and her experience were. But we are lucky that we have these letters from Timothy Fitch, the owner of the vessel, to Peter Gwynn, who was the ship captain, over a series of years when they were applying the West African coastal route or routes. And it's very clear that she could have been purchased at any number of West African ports, from Senegambia and possibly down to the Gold Coast or even further, because Gwynn went to these various places. It's also even possible that she was picked up in elsewhere and even in the Caribbean, because Gwynn's ship went there as well. But what we do know about the slave trade during this time was that even though it wasn't what Fitch wanted, on some of his voyages, it's very clear that Fitch and Gwynn, like others, and especially the ships that ended up in North America, had a disproportionate number of women and children, even if they didn't carry as high a price. And that it's very so that Phillis could have been bought or kidnapped close to the coast, or she could have come from further inland. But I think the most important thing is that her experience may not have been one day being kidnapped and then ending up on this ship and then the 6 or 8 week voyage of the Middle Passage. It may have been much more various. She may have been kidnapped, sold, kept in various places. That journey from wherever she was originally from all the way to Boston could have lasted 6 months, 9 months, a year, even longer. So that she may have had a very, what we would think of as a cosmopolitan experience of actually knowing a lot more about the way this world of war and slavery worked. Even though she was very young, she may have known more about this world of war and enslavement, as I argue, than we might think. And that may have informed her strategies of how to get along once she got to Boston.
Who were the Wheatleys? How did they make their money? What was their status in Boston?
There are two things that are said about John Wheatley. One is that he had a big house and that he was a merchant and that he owned a ship called the London Packet, and he was invested in whaling enterprises with some of those Nantucket merchants like the ones that Phillis wrote the poem about, who came to dinner that night in 1767. The other is that he was a tailor also. So I think that points to a lot of textiles going through his shop, probably importing textiles from London and elsewhere. And like a lot of merchants in Boston, he has expansive trade connections and he's doing rather well. The Wheatleys are older by the 1760s. They're in their 50s and 60s, still engaged in business, but starting to train the surviving son, Nathaniel, in the business, which he's going to take over. We actually know more about Phillis and have more testimony and letters from Phillis than all the other Wheatleys combined. But the other thing that's distinctive about them is that they are very active in evangelical and reforming circles. The Mohegan missionary who I mentioned Samson Occam, who Phillis wrote a letter to when she was 12, had stayed in their home, and he was a sensation. George Whitefield, the great evangelist, took him under his wing, and Whitefield had stayed in their house, and then Occam stays in their house, and they're involved in the starting of the school for natives to train missionaries in New England that eventually becomes Dartmouth College. And one might say that their attitude towards slavery is trying to have it both ways. Okay, this is the way of the world, this is the way of trade, but can we make it better? Can we make it an engine of heathens being saved and of us doing well? That's how I'm thinking about who they are and what their motives are for giving Phillis an unusual education, which wasn't typical of the education they seemed to have given their other slaves.
So aside from just being an assistant to Susanna Wheatley, the idea is that Phillis was more valuable, literate?
Yes, it's valuable as evidence of the Wheatleys' benevolence to the poor Africans and natives of the Americas and of their charitable intentions and their commitment to a kind of art, these elegies and these poems that she wrote, which were part of a Christianizing project. So they're responding to her brilliance and genius, but they're also enveloping it into a world in which poems are vehicles of personal feeling and testimony and personal connections, but also of a Christianizing process.
We're discussing the book, The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley, A Poet's Journey Through American Slavery and Independence. My guest is David Wallstreicher. You spend a good deal of time dissecting and giving us context for the elegies that Phillis wrote for people who had passed. First of all, why was she writing these elegies?
There are a couple of reasons. One is that this is a way of making connections with people who passed through the Wheatley's household, and of making others aware of her talents. And she does this again and again, seizes on opportunities provided by the death of people that she knew or knew about, or relatives of the people she knew about, to say something and to demonstrate her skill. And the great thing about elegies is that she could do both at the same time. It's like, it's not about me, it's about the dead person and the people who are mourning for that person and their relationship to God and to the grieving process. So it's a great way to, and a traditional way in New England, doing something audacious and really artistic and religious while not seeming not to be asking for much or calling attention to oneself. So I think that, and it's a popular genre, it's a religious genre. It's also a very open-ended one, and it's one that especially enabled one to write about, even if they're mostly about men and children. If she's writing about a man, she's writing to the grieving widow. So there's women all over these elegies. They're like actually the primary audience for them, even if they're not the majority of subjects. It enables her to do a particularly feminine thing as well.
I want to read the title of one. Elegiac poem on the death of that celebrated divine and eminent servant of Jesus Christ, the late Reverend and pious George Whitefield, chaplain to the Right Honorable the Countess of Huntington, who made his exit from this transitory state to dwell in the celestial realms of bliss on Lord's Day, 30th of September, 1770, when he was seized with a fit of the asthma at Newburyport near Boston in New England, in which is a condolatory address to his truly noble benefactress, the worthy and pious Lady Huntington, and the orphan children in Georgia, who with many thousands are left by the death of this great man to lament the loss of a father, friend, and benefactor by Phillis, a servant girl of 17 years of age, belonging to Mr. J. Wheatley of Boston, and has been but 9 years in this country from Africa. Wow. You wrote she could outdo anyone in these elegies.
She really masters the possibilities that they have for praising these figures like George Whitefield. And this is the perfect example because that's the one that really makes her famous on both sides of the Atlantic. And she makes it an occasion to talk about a lot of things about Whitefield's transatlantic ministry, including highlighting how important it was for Americans who are otherwise, she says explicitly, being neglected. But Whitefield understands that that we're fighting for our liberty, and he was supporting us, which he was doing actually, was saying critical things about administration policy right at the end of his life then. But also his ministry, particularly to natives and to Africans. And then in different versions of the poem, it's clear that she puts words in his mouth saying that he's saying that you'll be converted and you'll be free too. And in one version, it kind of seems like he's saying that you'll be free in the afterlife. right? It doesn't matter your worldly condition in this world. Slavery doesn't matter. We'll all be equal in the great beyond, in heaven. But there's another version in which it seems like she's saying, you'll be upraised and be priests like priests and kings, maybe in this world. I think she was thinking about how this might be read as potentially radical or too much, but it reflects Whitfield's own ambivalence, because 30 years before, Whitfield, when he had been founding that orphanage that's mentioned in the title in Georgia, he was criticizing people in Georgia. Georgia was founded without slavery, but then they decided it wasn't viable and they were going to have slaves anyway. And eventually Whitfield funds his orphanage by having this plantation, which was given to him, and saying, oh, it's okay if the plantation staffed by slaves, because really it's all about this orphanage, which is supporting the evangelical project. He makes his peace with slavery. But then 30 years later, she says, you know what? He's more sympathetic to us. Maybe he's really thinking that slavery is going to end and this Christianizing process is going to be part of that. So she's intervening in this big issue about where evangelicalism is going to go and what Whitfield's mission might mean for Africans, whether it's going to just make slavery better and thus be another excuse for it, or whether, in fact, it's going to have some real anti-slavery power.
You're listening to my full bio conversation with historian David Wallstreicher. His book is titled The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley. Next, we continue with a look at Phillis Wheatley's political writings. This is All of It. This is All of It. I'm Allison Stewart. We're continuing our conversation about Phillis Wheatley, the first African-American and enslaved person to publish a book of poetry. CUNY history professor David Wallstreicher tells her story in The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley, a poet's journey through American slavery and independence. Enslaved by John and Susanna Wheatley, Phillis was recognized at a young age as a gifted writer. After failing to find a publisher in Boston, she traveled to England, where her poetry was published, and she met prominent figures, including Benjamin Franklin. Phillis Wheatley was in Boston at an incredible time, the ramp up to the American Revolution. She was there at the time of the Boston Tea Party. She wrote a poem called To the King's Most Excellent Majesty on his repealing the American Stamp Act. I was curious about why she chose to weigh in.
That actually is the same year that she starts writing poems that are addressed to secular officials and that have a political cast to them. So she understands that there is this world of political discussion that overlaps with the religious one, but isn't the same. And she doesn't see a contradiction between being a political poet and a religious one. In fact, the two might actually feed each other. And I think that she hasn't gotten quite enough credit for just how early and consistently she was pushing the envelope in terms of politics, and doing so in ways that really couldn't be pinned down.
What do people think about this young enslaved girl/woman publishing these poems, these political poems, these religious poems, having a point of view, one poem taking on the voice of a minister?
It's extremely bold, and she's extremely careful. The ones that are more political, she's writing them, they get shown around. She's not publishing them as quickly as the other ones. She's very careful because it's not clear what she can get away with. And so I try to suggest that as I'm telling the story, just how careful and subtle she's having to be. But it's still hard to get our head around just how bold she's being. And I think that her poem, for example, the famous one on being brought from Africa to America, which is only 8 lines long, and which has traditionally been read as being thankful for being saved from being a savage and not Christian in Africa, and so it's good that I was enslaved and brought to America. I think that it can be read very differently, that she's actually satirizing that view, that religious view.
Let me stop you right there. I'm going to read that poem, because I was going to ask you about it next. So this is On Being Brought from Africa to America by Phillis Wheatley.
'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join thy angelic train. Now there's our italics in this on certain parts of it, and you argue that she's being, is irony the right word, or sarcastic, or accusatory? What do you think?
All three. So there are really two parts to it. And that first part where she says, "Mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand there's a God, there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew." She is presenting this idea that's being used to justify slavery, but she knows very well that some Methodists and others are already criticizing this, the way that pro-slavery people are using this idea of saving the Africans by kidnapping them and bringing them to America, and trying to forestall this religious critique of the slave trade and slavery that Quakers and some Methodists and others are already engaging in. She's satirizing the racism that people are playing with, and really not just both relying on and developing in responses to criticisms of slavery.
We're talking about the book, The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley, A Poet's Journey Through American Slavery and Independence. My guest is David Waldstreicher. So whose idea was it for Phillis Wheatley to write a proposal around 1771, 70, when she's about 18 or 19 years old, to write a proposal for a book?
We don't know. What's most striking is that the Wheatleys are on board with it, and that they try several times before they actually decide to do it in London. They try to do it in Boston. There are printers who are willing to entertain it and to try to get subscriptions, but for various reasons, some of them economic, some of them having to do with the particular situations of those printers and how it's changing rapidly with all the political controversy, and the fact that publishing books is not usually a profit-making thing at this time in Boston or anywhere. But we can't say that it was really the Wheatley family pushing it, especially given how important it becomes to her, and how eventually she says in letters that the Wheatleys have agreed to free her when she returns from London. And she says to several people, "Help me sell the book because it's going to be all I have to depend upon."
Mm-hmm. So the Wheatleys and Phillis decide that England is going to be their best route for her to be published. Who were they going to England to woo? Who did they need to or want to convince to support the publishing of her book of poetry?
First, there's Countess Huntingdon, and they send the captain of the London packet, the boat they own, which regularly goes back and forth from Boston to London. They send the packet. They send Captain Calef, Robert Calef, who Wheatley actually writes about as a kind of classical hero in the poem Ocean, a poem that she writes on the way back from England aboard the London packet. They send him and with a bunch of poems to contact a printer, who then goes to Countess Huntingdon, and he writes, the printer and Calef write letters where they make it clear that Huntingdon's really impressed and says, "Wow, these are great. I feel my soul to knit with her," which is a very Methodist thing of saying. And Huntingdon, she really was a patron of Field and other evangelicals, but also especially of some of the first Black Atlantic writers, the authors of the first slave narratives and things like that. She's part of this. She's really a famous person in these evangelical networks, and friends with Lord Dartmouth, who was a high government official, as well as also famous for being a pious Methodist. So the idea here is, if you get these literal aristocrats, these lords and ladies, Huntingdon and Dartmouth, to sign on to this project, literally to put their name on it, then that leads to possibilities that are just that don't really exist in the same way. But so that's why you have this attestation in the book that says, where all the Boston people say, like basically the equivalent of the lords and ladies of Boston, though they're not actual aristocrats, but the governor, leading ministers, people like that, sign and say, we attest that Phillis Wheatley has actually written these poems. They have to do that because nobody in London, Huntington says, am I being conned here? How do I know she really wrote them? So they go, eventually she goes over with this piece of paper that says she really wrote them. And then when she's there, she goes around to see a whole bunch of important people, including one of the first people she goes to see is this guy, this major patron of the arts, who then she imitates in the first poem that's going to appear in the book. And his name is escaping me right now because it's so hard to remember because I'd never heard of him until I was halfway through my research. But he died shortly afterwards, so he doesn't get seen as much. But she does say
is it Littleton? Littleton?
Yeah, Lord Littleton.
George
Littleton. Thank you. So Littleton had patronized poets. He was a friend of Alexander Pope's, and he's 70 years old. But he had patronized so many important poets and writers that they nicknamed him Maecenas, which was the name of the patron of Virgil and Horace and a lot of these other Roman poets, because he was so famous for being this literary talent spotter and encourager, and a poet and a historian himself. Who's her patron, who's her Maecenas, who she's writing to in this poem directly. It's all these people who might make it possible for her to have the really only path for a literary career in the 18th century, which is to have this lasting patronage, which will translate into some kind of a livelihood and ability to have the leisure to keep writing.
I found it interesting that Benjamin Franklin approached her. He was very cagey.
Yes.
In the way that he approached Phillis Wheatley. Why wouldn't he want to be seen as either supporting or detracting from Phillis Wheatley? And how is he indicative of her challenges?
This was one of the origins of this book project also, because I wrote a book about Franklin and slavery called Runaway America, Benjamin Franklin, Slavery and the American Revolution. And I had a couple of paragraphs in there about his encounter with her. And at a time, this is when she's over in London. And we've come to think of Franklin as anti-slavery because he clearly was at the very end of his life, but I was arguing that it's much more complicated. He has a much more complicated relationship to slavery. And as the colony's fourth most important representative in London, the point man for the colonists, really, and literally the representative of diplomat of several of the colonies in 1771, 72, as he had been for years. He's doing damage control. The slavery issue is being thrown in their face. Tories are saying that they're hypocrites. And the Somerset decision has already made this distinction between the law of slavery in England, that inferior colonial law, and whatever his personal beliefs by this time, he still owned slaves himself. He's most concerned with how if she is celebrated and she's being shown the Tower of London by Granville Sharp while she's over there, the abolitionist, the potential is for Wheatley to really embarrass the Americans. And as more than one of the initial reviews of her book actually shortly did. On the other hand, if he criticizes her, that would play into the hands of the critics. So he doesn't want to encourage her because of the way she might be used, but he doesn't want to discourage her because that would look bad too. So he says to one of his cousins, who the Wheatleys had asked him to help her out while she's over there, he says, I went to see her as you asked, but it seemed like her young master, Nathaniel Wheatley, who she's traveling with, he didn't even come out to see me. So I took a quick exit and I've heard no more about her, and that's it. So I think that Franklin's a diplomat, and Franklin's very careful and cagey and very effective in the way he deals with people and the way he deals with publicity, especially. So I think that he's being very careful, trying to have it both ways. He's not being anti-slavery, but he's not being pro-slavery. He's mainly concerned with being pro-American and realizing that she's a potential hot potato. I shouldn't stop talking about this without noting that she parlays that into later on proposing to dedicate her second book in 1779 to him when he's minister to France. And that's misled some scholars and biographers to suggest that, he was a supporter of her because he was so abolitionist. No, she's using the fact that he couldn't distance himself from her publicly to say, as she says in one letter home, I met him, he came to see me. That shows like how much respect I was getting, and daring him basically to say, oh no, I don't think you're great, which she knows he won't do.
That's a big part of the book, that Phillis Wheatley really poses a problem for people in Boston and people in what will be the United States, the Patriots, who want their freedom, yet they enslave people. That she really becomes a symbol of the hypocrisy of it all, correct?
Yes. And this is a bit of a, I have to admit, might seem counterintuitive or a flipping of the traditional interpretation where Wheatley's often been seen as exceptional. She can't possibly represent slavery because she had an experience that hardly any other slave would seem to have had. So what can she possibly tell us about slavery in the era of the Revolution, or about the relationship of the Revolution to slavery? She actually becomes a kind of lightning rod for this vexed question of the relationship between slavery and the Revolution. And I think even broader than that, the question that we find it hard to realize that people were asking, which was, what is this American version of slavery? Is it enough to just listen to the people who defend it, who say there's always been slavery and this is just our version of it? And there's slavery in the Bible, so God must have said it's okay. And the Greeks and Romans had slavery. And look, the Africans enslave each other, so what's wrong with buying their slaves? That wasn't that. So that pro-slavery people said, and we've been hoodwinked. Even those of us who want to condemn it for all the right reasons, we've been hoodwinked into believing that nobody was questioning it back then. The slave trade, especially in Anglo-America, got bigger, and it was so obvious that it was a death trap, and it was racialized, and it wasn't getting better, and all the ways it had been justified, including by that we're going to Christianize them, had been proven to be wrong. And that was becoming obvious to more and more people. And that's what Wheatley can see. She can see that slavery is not the same. Yeah, you could say slavery has existed everywhere in human history, but that doesn't mean it's the same. It doesn't mean it's always racial and hereditary. Mm-hmm. It always looks like it does, like the death traps in Jamaica. If Boston looks more like Rome, where accomplished slaves get emancipated and can earn their freedom, then let's push the envelope on that. Those are the questions about slavery that she is dealing with, and then get mixed up in this question when it becomes highly politicized about the whether Bostonians in particular, but Americans in general, are hypocrites because they talk about their own liberty while they oppress their slaves more than anybody else in the world is oppressed, or whether they are sincere and actually, if you let them, they would end slavery, as some of them start to say. In some of my other work as well, and in light of the recent controversies about slavery and the Revolution, the 1619 Project became a lightning rod for. What my line has become, and I say it explicitly in the book, is that Wheatley helps us see that not only was slavery an issue in the American Revolution, but that things were going in both directions. Slavery was being newly justified, racialized, and growing at the same time that it was also being attacked. And so things are going in both pro-slavery and anti-slavery directions. And that's how we end up with this country that's half slave and half free in terms of North and South and a geography. But all in all, slavery actually grows, and that's the more important fact. But there is also this anti-slavery movement that Wheatley is part of and plays an important role in that should not be forgotten too. So she is looking at both these things happening at once, the rise of anti-slavery and the growth of slavery. And she's dealing with that contradictory reality that we are coming around to realizing was a much more public and important conversation than sometimes either conventional wisdom on the American Revolution or the conventional wisdom on slavery and anti-slavery might lead us to think.
You're listening to my full bio conversation with historian David Wallstreicher. His book is titled The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley. Next, in our final installment, we look at Phillis Wheatley's emancipation from slavery and her later years. This is All of It. This is All of It. I'm Allison Stewart. Today is History Friday, and we've been discussing the first African-American and the first enslaved person to publish a book of poetry in the United States, 18th century writer Phillis Wheatley. CUNY history professor David Wallstreicher is the author of The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley, a poet's journey through American slavery and independence. With Wheatley's success as a writer came her admirers, including George Washington, and her detractors, including Thomas Jefferson. But perhaps the most important result of the publication of her book was Wheatley obtaining her freedom. Waldstreicher writes, quote, Wheatley made her book that much more effective as an argument against both slavery in general as her own enslavement in particular. In his book, he presents 4 scenarios for how Phillis Wheatley may have been emancipated.
The most likely scenario is that the Wheatleys were embarrassed by all the praise she got, and people started to say publicly that there was a contradiction between saying she was so amazing and her actually still being a slave. Some people, like Benjamin Rush, praising her in print in 1772-3, actually just assumed that she was no longer a slave. And the Wheatleys get caught up short by this, and Phillis kind of uses it to push the envelope. My friends in England demanded or suggested that I should be freed. And then in another letter, she says it was the Wheatleys' idea. So it's ambiguous, and there are 4 possible scenarios as I lay out. But I think the most likely one is that it was ambiguous. It was on the horizon, but there was no clear sense of when it was going to happen, because the Wheatleys are getting old anyway, and she's becoming an adult. But the process gets accelerated by her going to London and the publication of her book. But she doesn't want to look like she has demanded it or made it happen. So she kind of covers her tracks and talks about it differently to different people. And I think that's an extremely revealing fact. It shows just how much she's under a microscope and just how potentially political even the most basic facts about her life and experience have become because she's famous.
You write Wheatley could mean very different things to different people and even the same people at this time. So it sounds like she's both a mirror and a window at the same time. How is she a mirror for people? How is she a window into a certain way of thinking?
She's a mirror in that she helps people think about the possible futures of slavery and what Africans might be and what's possible. And I love that we haven't even talked about the thing that used to be said to be the most important, was that that Henry Louis Gates stressed years ago in his work on Wheatley. Just the very fact of an African being a genius seemed to be an anti-slavery argument and forced a confrontation with with an idea that Africans were backward or even unequal in some biological sense. So these ideas of inherent inequality or pagan inequality were not only had existed, but they were actually being developed by people who wanted to defend slavery or not have to deal with how bad it was. So she's a mirror for that conversation about what the evidence is for African equality, what that implied for slavery, and what that would imply for the future of Blacks in the New World. She's a window in so many ways, a window for all these people who are dealing with her into possible futures, I suppose. But she's also a window for us into the fact that even in a history that we think we know so and that we think was going in a clear direction, people at the time didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know what was going to happen with the the imperial controversy. They didn't know what was going to happen with slavery. Their world was complicated with multiple political and economic conflicts, but also multiple identities. One of the things I stress in the middle of the book is that Phillis Wheatley insists on being British and African and American. And not until after 1776, she's letting go of the British part. But at various points, you see her very aware that she is making what we would call an identity claim that is powerful and not singular.
I did want to note 2 things before we get to the end of Phillis's life. 2 of her founding fathers had very different opinions of Phillis Wheatley. George Washington thought her a worthy correspondent, although I think she was actually more famous than he was at the time. And Thomas Jefferson thought her to be unsophisticated. He would publish work about that after her death. I was just very curious why a poet would write to General George Washington?
Wheatley is writing about leaders, religious leaders from the beginning, but she's quite aware that both in Africa and in ancient Greece and Rome and in 18th century England, one of the jobs of ambitious poets is to celebrate military victories and political leaders. Washington knows very well that the commander-in-chief of the armies and of a nation that's trying to come into existence needs poets to celebrate them. And she knows that he knows that. And so she writes this poem, and she writes a whole bunch of poems about American generals. And so she writes this poem to him. It's a continuation of this project. And he sits on it for a little while because he's not sure whether he wants to acknowledge her, but eventually he does. Basically, the way he can benefit from having this cool poem that praises him at a time when he has rivals some people think he should be demoted and somebody else should run the army. It's just irresistible to him. And so that's why she writes to him, and that's why eventually he writes back and gets her poem published in a newspaper and in the New Pennsylvania magazine that's edited by Thomas Paine. So in terms of Washington and Jefferson, we have one seeming embrace, and then we have one posthumous rejection. Jefferson in Notes on the State of Virginia dissing her. Religion could produce a Phillis Wheatley, but it could not produce a poet. And then he says the poems published under her name are beneath the dignity of criticism. So what's going on there? Is there really just such a variance of opinion about whether she's a good poet or not? I don't think so. I think it's completely situational. Wheatley's making Washington look good, and so he's willing to play along, even if that might have some risk. But when Washington's doing that, he has just dealt with the question of whether blacks in New England can serve in the army. And he's kind of said, okay, if they're free, all right. Or if their masters free them, okay. And this is in the context of the British potentially and actually freeing slaves in Virginia in order to serve with them. So I think Jefferson knows all about her, and there's a copy of her book in his collection in the Library of Congress that has marginalia in it that I think he wrote. And that's one of the illustrations in the book. And he, in that same book, in Notes on the State of Virginia, if I can simplify his extended the extended things he says about slavery, he makes two moves that we find that we can't put together. On the one hand, he says slavery is a terrible thing. It's bad for white Virginians, and we're oppressing this nation. And if God is real, we know someday they'll be free, and we should free them and someday this will have to be dealt with. So he has this amazing anti-slavery passage buried in there. But he has this longer passage where he says that I have a suspicion that they're inferior. And in any case, when they eventually get freed, they can't possibly be in this country because we're so different. And besides, they're going to hate us anyway because of all the things we've done to them. So they can't ever possibly be citizens. So his distancing from her and other African writers is a direct response to those people who said, look, they're African geniuses. They can be Christians and they can be equal and everything's going in the right direction. It's a direct response to that, but saying, no, we're having a lot of trouble dealing with just how many slaves we have, and we can't end this right now. And in fact, the Virginia legislature has decided not to, in its new constitution, even make an emancipation statute. So basically, we need to stick with the public opinion here that basically says that if these people are here, they're going to be slaves, and the next generation will have to deal with it. And so he disses her for political reasons. And so it's not a matter of belief for either one of them. I think they both recognize that he's a genius. They just deal with that in different ways at different moments.
By 1778, both of the Wheatleys are gone, John and Susanna. Practically, what does that mean for Phillis Wheatley?
She was back in Boston living in the old house with John Wheatley. The surviving children, Nathaniel and Mary, had gotten married. We don't know who else was in the household. She's not mentioned in the will. So even though she has good relations with the Wheatley children, she is suddenly left without the support of having a place to live. And that's when almost immediately she marries John Peters and starts a family of her own.
3 weeks after the death of John Wheatley, Phillis Wheatley marries John Peters. Is there any indication that this was a love marriage, or was this a marriage of convenience or maybe even necessity?
I think there's no reason to think of it as any different than any other marriage in the late 18th century. We can't say it's about love. We can't say it's not about love. What we can say is that John Peters, he's really gotten a bum rap because some of the Wheatley's descendants said nasty things about him and instead of blaming themselves for her early death and what they saw as her tragic end, they blamed him because he was in debtor's prison when she died and had economic troubles. But actually, there's lots of testimony that he was extremely impressive, a successful businessman, represented other Africans in court, owned property. He's about as close to a male version of Phillis Wheatley as we can see in the surviving records of that time. Their experience of moving around and trying different things in the early 1780s is very typical of the Revolutionary War years, when the economy is really swinging wildly. When they're in the city, things aren't so good in the city. And then when they move to the countryside, taxes are up and the economy in the countryside is bad. And so the moving around they do is very typical of a depressed post-war economy. And it's really not that surprising that they suffer and that he ends up in debtor's prison. The only people who end up in debtor's prison are the people who actually had money at some time, because putting them there is a way of trying to get their friends to pay their bills for them and get them out.
This difficult economy, was this one of the reasons why Phillis never published again?
She did publish poems, and I think more than we've realized. From some anonymous poems, I think she published in newspapers, but I think she's saving some for the book. But it's clear that she floats an idea for a table of contents, even for another book manuscript in 1779. And there's talk about it later on. After she dies, John Peters tries to work with some printers twice. First and soon after she dies, and he says that he asks people to return her manuscripts, if they have any, to him to do that. And then a decade later, he's working with some Boston printers and including Isaiah Thomas, who had printed some of her stuff before in Worcester, to try to get it out. And he puts out an advertisement for it. So yeah, the fact of there not being a second book is tied to how bad the economy was. If she had lived longer, I'm sure it would have happened.
Yeah, Phillis Wheatley died young at just 31. And you write that it has been Black women who have kept her legacy alive over time.
Oh, absolutely. In the period before the Civil War, it's the abolitionists, Black and white, who not only keep talking about her, but keep publishing her poems. And I present evidence of that. And so she's seen as like a major famous first and an inspiration and a poster child for literacy and uplift. But by the time you get to the late 19th century, when poetic styles are changing, and also when it's so clear that Black women are really in charge of especially programs for kids and educational institutions for kids and literature for kids, they start naming clubs after her and hospitals and schools. They really, even more than the men, who start to say things like she's not really radical enough. Maybe she wasn't a great writer. She wasn't challenging the white man sufficiently. But you start to see this difference of opinion, and you start to really see how important the women were to keeping her memory alive. And that really persists all the way through the 20th century, and even to the new interpretations of her in the 70s and 80s that stress what she was up against and how challenging and sophisticated some of her poems were. She's very into art for art's sake, as well as for political sake. And so she has all the virtues of the Romantic poets, some of whom were political and some of whom were just about saying art is the new religion. Art is about self-expression. Art is about doing the most amazing things that human beings can do, and doing it publicly as well as privately. So I think that's what I mean when I say that her subject is herself, that we can see in her those things that we value in poetry, whether we value the political, however much we put on her politics and how effective or how limited it may have been. We can also see her as doing something that poets have aspired to ever since.
That was the final installment of my conversation with historian and CUNY professor David Waldstreicher, author of The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley, A Poet's Journey Through American Slavery and Independence. And that's all of it. All of it is produced by Kate Hines, Jordan Loff, Simon Close, Zach Goddard-Cohen, L. Malik Anderson, Luke Green, and Sasha Cohen. Megan Ryan is the head of live radio. Our engineer is Juliana Fonda. Luscious Jackson does our music. Our interns this summer were Emily and Joey Jerva. Today is their very last day. Thanks for everything. If you missed any of this week's segments, catch up with our podcast, available wherever you get our podcasts. If you like what you hear, please leave us a great rating. I'm Allison Stewart. I appreciate you listening, and I appreciate you. I'll meet you back here next time.